Chapter 27, Section 2. Most Americans supported this war, and you would even have a visual way to see that support with the display of stars in people's windows. And different color stars would have different meanings. For example, a blue star meant that your household had a loved one in the service. A gold star meant that your household experienced a death in combat. And the government's going to work really hard to make sure this morale is kept up, this support, which was really important early on when things weren't going as well. You know, the media was encouraged to do their part, whether in song or the movies or on the radio. And you saw the creation of the Office of War Information to control the flow of war news at home. You had to be careful what you were saying. If you had any information about the war, you couldn't just tell people. You didn't know who would overhear it. It could be a spy. You know, you never knew, and you don't want you talking being the reason that somebody died. Americans are going to change their lifestyles to help the war effort. I mean, people cut luxuries, even necessities at times. You had victory gardens being planted again, making more food available to soldiers. You had worry that could we be attacked here, especially on the West Coast. You know, Japan could cross the sea and attack us, could bomb us. And West Coast cities would be blacked out at night to make them harder targets for Japanese bombers if they were to come. You know, and they had practice air raid drills and everything. Japan, by the way, did bomb us, but not with planes. They used balloon bombs that they would launch from Japan and just trust the airstream to drop them over the U.S. So some of them did hit the U.S., but no major cities or anything like that. Although people made sacrifices, in some ways life didn't change that drastically. People still went to plays. Music still was produced, albeit less innocent than World War I music. For example, a World War II song was called Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition. You know, you had paperbacks introduced to replace hardcovers. 60 million paperback books were distributed to our troops. You know, a paperback book makes it easier to carry, less material used to make it. For some, life on the home front changed really dramatically. For example, women. Women had been discouraged from working during the Depression. But now women were encouraged to replace the soldiers that were leaving. And the government used advertisement to make this point. And the symbol of that patriotic American woman was Rosie the Riveter. 1940 to 44, women in the workplace increased by 6 million. You know, they worked in factories. They drove truck. They were reporters. But they received less pay than men still. And while some viewed these jobs as temporary, some hoped that this was going to be permanent change. Racial tensions continued during World War II. African Americans continued to face discrimination. They did have some more opportunities because as people left to go fight in the war, there were more job openings at home. But about 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces, but the units were still segregated. Most of the units were kept out of combat, usually given low-level duties like cooks. Back at home, some white factory workers would go on strike if black workers tried to replace white workers in the factory that had left. Even though during World War II there was a no strike pledge. These weren't striking for better work conditions or pay. These were referred to as hate strikes. A. Philip Randolph is going to plan a march in Washington, D.C. in 1941 to bring attention to the racial injustices here at home. Preventing the march, FDR is going to issue an executive order to prevent discrimination in government jobs. And you saw the creation of the Fair Employment Practices Committee. And their job was to check companies that worked in defense work to make sure that they would consider all qualified applicants, regardless of race. But there weren't strong enforcement powers if a company didn't. What then? You have riots in some northern cities where a lot of African Americans had moved after World War I. Let's look at Mexican Americans. About 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the military in World War II. One of the most famous units was the Blue Devils, the 88th Division. It was one of our top combat units in World War II, and it was mostly a Mexican American unit. We had just talked about the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Committee. The assistant chairperson of the FEPC was Carlos Castaneda, who was working to improve Mexican American working conditions. Many Mexican Americans are going to leave the Southwest U.S. and head to the industrial centers in the Northeast and the Midwest to help out in the factories there. But the problem is this left a empty spot in the Southwest as the workers left. And in 1942, the U.S. and Mexico are going to reach an agreement for thousands of farm and railroad workers to come to the Southwest to work. They were called braceros. In June of 1943, you're going to have something happen in Los Angeles called the Zoot Suit Riots. The Zoot Suit was a style of suit. It was a popular style of suit amongst young Mexican Americans. And sailors in Los Angeles began attacking young Mexican Americans. And this becomes known as the Zoot Suit Riots. The government will eventually step in and put a stop to this, but not before many had been beaten. The Los Angeles Police Department had supposedly tried to stop this by arresting the Mexican American youth. Let's talk Japanese American relocation. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were going to be subject to internment. Basically, they're going to be forced to relocate and imprisoned. In 1941, there were about 119,000 people of Japanese descent living on the West Coast. Let's break this down. About a third are what they referred to as Issei, meaning they had been born in Japan and had moved here. And by law, they could not be U.S. citizens. But about 2/3, the majority of them were Nisei. They had been born here. Therefore, they're U.S. citizens. Many of the Nisei had never even been to Japan. There was no evidence of disloyalty by either one of these groups. But the fear of sabotage allowed for the rise of anti-Japanese feelings, and it allowed for the removal of the Japanese people. Executive Order number 9066 was issued in February of 1942, and Japanese Americans are going to be ordered to detention camps. Basically, they had a little bit of warning, and they are told to prepare because they're leaving. I mean, these people had work and shops and homes that they had to figure out what to do with. And then they would be shipped, usually by bus, sometimes by train, to these camps. And these camps were dreary places with the bare necessities in the middle of nowhere, with armed guards and barbed wire surrounding the camps. If you were in Hawaii, the Japanese population of Hawaii was so large that they couldn't relocate all of them. They relocated what they considered some high-risk people, but overall, the Hawaiian Islands were put under martial law, military law, for the whole war. Some Japanese men volunteered for military service to prove their patriotism, but they had segregated units. And typically were sent to Europe to fight. The 442nd was a mostly Japanese American unit, one of the war's most decorated units. They fought in Europe. Others would serve as interpreters and translators in the war against Japan. And the Supreme Court was going to get a case brought forth by some Japanese Americans questioning the legality of this relocation, of this internment. And the Supreme Court said it was okay due to the situation and the war we were in. Most Japanese Americans are going to be held in these camps until the war's end in 1945. As a side note, on this YouTube channel, under some of the videos, there are some more videos referring to this Japanese American relocation if you want to watch them as well, which I highly recommend.